Earlier today, Starfield got a new beta update. This was a roughly 15 gigabyte update to the game, and it's only on Steam, at least for now. Effectively, Steam users got an early preview and testing phase for this update, as Bethesda is collecting feedback on their Discord server, which I'll have a link to down below if you want to add feedback yourself. And to get this one, simply opt into the beta on Steam, and the update will start downloading, and you could opt out and revert to the public version of the game at any point after that. What was by far the largest change to come from this patch were the performance overhauls. Bethesda added in new upscalers like DLSS and DLSS 3.0, aka frame generation, but also DLAA and NVIDIA Reflex. And while all of these are great additions to the game, they're only for NVIDIA users, but thankfully Bethesda also had some blanket performance improvements that came with this update. Although these are only going to be for higher end systems, or at least Bethesda specifies that. So testing this new update with just FSR2 enabled, none of the other fancy upscalers, I get a roughly 5 FPS gain in Aquila City, which is honestly huge because this is taking me from 60 to about 65 FPS. It seems like this is going to largely be thanks to some improved CPU utilization and likely some behind the scenes optimization. And it seems like in general with my specific PC, I'm getting a few extra FPS in cities. For both New Atlantis and Neon, I noticed 2 to 3 extra FPS consistently. But for better or worse, I only noticed this bump in cities. On some of the more desolate planets, my FPS was almost identical as to what it was in the previous version. But I mean, right off the bat, that's a really good start. Aquila City has been the worst performing area of Starfield for me, and like I just got a free FPS bump thanks to nothing but further optimizations from Bethesda. It seems like this definitely should benefit at least a fair amount of users out there. Again, it seems like it's focused towards higher end PCs, but then thankfully you also do have the new addition with DLSS. And I gotta say, this is one of the biggest performance gains I have ever seen in an update for a video game. So comparing DLSS on the new beta version of the game to FSR from the old version, the current live version of the game, I got about a 40 FPS gain, which is just absolute insanity. And with just a straight up head-to-head comparison on the beta build of the game using FSR versus DLSS, it is a gigantic 30 to 35 FPS improvement. And on my system, this is basically everywhere, both in cities, but even on some of the more desolate planets. In Neon, I was even getting about a 45 FPS boost at points. Aquila City is definitely more CPU bound, so it was a mere 30 FPS climb, but even still, you could see a large bump in CPU utilization here. And that's honestly huge, because this is just with the older regular DLSS. This is much more widely available compared to frame generation, and using this, I'm able to play Starfield with about 100 FPS at all times, compared to the launch version of the game where I would regularly be at 50 to 60 FPS in cities. This is a gigantic improvement. So if you're out there with a 2000 or 3000 series NVIDIA GPU, you're probably going to see some giant performance gains as a result of this. Many of the early online reports are similar, people getting major FPS boosts in Starfield even on some older hardware, and even compared to some of the free DLSS mods of the past. For me, using the DLSS mod did not lead to a huge boost in performance, but clearly here I am getting a huge boost in performance. But if you do have some of the new hardware and do have a 4000 series NVIDIA GPU, you can take advantage of frame generation. And congrats, because now you are always going to be playing Starfield at well over 100 FPS. Comparing frame generation to just FSR2, both on the beta build, I get almost double the FPS at points. And to be clear, this is at 4K resolution with all of the settings maxed out. And here I'm able to pull over 100 FPS in every single location, and even if you were somebody relying on a frame generation mod, this is a huge improvement over those mods. The official implementation of frame generation, I was getting about a 10 to 20 FPS bonus compared to the mod implementation. So of course, what's dominating the narrative here are the performance gains, but on top of that, since we are using DLSS over FSR, there are some quality improvements. The upscaling tech from DLSS is just a bit better, so you can definitely notice the quality in some points looks a bit sharper. Things are a bit more clear. Although unfortunately, at least as of right now, this is definitely a beta and there are some bugs. With frame generation specifically, I got a decent amount of these weird flickering bugs when things and NPCs would momentarily vanish while playing. But even further, my FPS was just not nearly as stable. I would get 20 FPS jumps at points. It was fine because I was still going from 120 to 140 FPS, but things were very rarely rock solid when using DLSS, particularly with frame generation. But the DLSS presets are also quite bug. So whenever you set a certain preset for DLSS, it'll automatically switch to a different preset almost at random. It basically seems like it's shifting over a couple of options depending on whatever option you chose. I was trying to record all of these benchmarks on the balanced mode, but it seems like in reality I was actually recording on the quality mode, unless this is just a visual error and I'm actually on balanced mode, but it's actually saying quality in the menu for some reason. But hey, that's why this update's in a beta and not actually released yet. And Bethesda did denote a known bug here, as if you do have frame generation on, VSync must be off for this to work. But if you're somebody hoping for some performance upgrades in Starfield, this patch absolutely delivered. I think almost everyone will notice at least a small bump in FPS from this one, with Nvidia users particularly seeing a notable bump in their overall performance across the entirety of this game. It took a long time, but Bethesda absolutely knocked it out of the park with their DLSS implementation. Although that wasn't the only change, even on the visual side from this update. They added in the ability to adjust brightness and contrast from the menu as well, and HDR brightness can now be adjusted if your system supports it. These changes are incredibly handy for just accessibility and control reasons. Caves are really dark in Starfield, and some people just don't see super good in the dark. So being able to tweak these settings to your desired look is just a great feature to have now. They describe how they improve the performance of NPCs' eyes, so hopefully that uncanny staring is gone, and yeah, this is actually a pretty nice improvement. NPCs not only seem to stare at you a bit less and break eye contact more often, but even further, their eyes definitely just look a lot better. The NPCs look a bit more human now, and the stares, even when they do happen, don't take you out of the game as much because of these overhauled eye textures. They added in the ability to eat food found in the world, so now instead of having to pick up that food, you can just consume it as it stands there. On one hand, this vastly increases the utility of random food items. A lot of the times, if I ran into food, I would just ignore it because I didn't feel like picking it up and then eating it, but now I'll actually interact with those items, eating them pretty much whenever I see them. But food in Starfield still barely heals any HP, making this change great, but kind of pointless. If you're actively playing Starfield and trying to survive, you'll know that food builds don't really do anything. Once you get past level 5, a 5 HP gain from some food isn't really going to make any notable difference. So hopefully later on we do get a proper food rebalance, which will make this aspect of the update far more powerful. In the patch notes, they describe adjusting stealth to be more forgiving, but I honestly didn't notice a huge difference here. I still feel like enemies were able to notice me from shockingly far away, and even in this head-to-head comparison, I get noticed in almost the exact same position, so I'm not entirely clear what these stealth changes are. But at least for me, I haven't noticed a ton, but for those of you that do play stealth more regularly in Starfield, let me know in the comments down below. Were there any more minute changes you noticed from this update? And of course, there were a ton of bug fixes to come with this one too. A variety of these were just general fixes to miscellaneous bugs in the game, but far more important were some of the progress blocking quest fixes, of which we got about 10 in total. So if you're running into issues completing the main story, the Freestar questline, Ryujin, or even Crimson Fleet questlines, there is a decent chance that your issue was fixed with this update. Although unfortunately, there is definitely at least some quests that are not fixed from this one. Namely, a ton of the bugs around the ESS constant do not appear to be fixed, as well as some of the bugs during the Divided Loyalties quest. And I feel like this update overall does just leave a lot to be desired. The performance improvements are absolutely fantastic. Bethesda deserves all of the praise on that front. And the FPS bonus I get from this update completely blew me away. I was genuinely shocked when I saw the FPS to the point where I triple checked to make sure my settings were correct. But at the same time, this is leaving me wondering why on earth wasn't DLSS available on release? More FPS isn't going to get me to replay Starfield again. It just seems like a particularly bizarre decision from Bethesda to not include DLSS on release when it's otherwise a standard for most games out there. So now this is absolutely a situation where it's better late than never, but I still am left wondering, why is it late? This would have been really nice about 200 hours ago for my playthrough. Even further, when you look at how long this update took, it's now been over 1 month since the last update to Starfield, 34 changes and fixes in total, which is how many this update had, doesn't really seem like that many. Like, to be clear, this is the big update. We are just a bit removed from launch, and they've been working on this one for over a month now. Maybe I was misguided, but I was just kind of hoping for some more fixes or changes here, especially when you consider that this update clearly isn't done yet. There are still bugs with the update, so it'll likely need at least 1 to 2 more weeks of testing. And in the patch notes, Bethesda describes how this update will be releasing on all platforms later this month. month. Thanksgiving is coming up in the US, and I can't imagine they're dropping this update that week since it's the single biggest travel week in the US all year, so a lot of devs will likely be on vacation, not working and visiting their families. I wouldn't be shocked if we don't see this update drop publicly for another 2 to 3 weeks in the final few days of November, which definitely creates a weird situation where there's this rather large 7 to 8 week gap in between updates, and this is the size of the update. It's not like it's blowing me away in its scale. The performance improvements are absolutely phenomenal, but there's a lot of bugs that still need to be fixed that definitely aren't included here. But in fairness to Bethesda, they did do a great job at implementing all of these planned features in a surprisingly quick fashion. I for one thought that some of these features wouldn't get added until 2024, but with this update it seems like everything will have been implemented. So as far as this patch overall goes, it's definitely the best patch Starfield has gotten thus far, but I can't help but feel like these updates are just taking a surprisingly long time, and it's not like we're getting a mountain of fixes here. For a lot of games, this update would be on the smaller side based on the number of changes. But I do really like this Steam beta usage here. It seems like a great way to preview and test updates with the community a few weeks before they are launched publicly, and I hope the Steam beta thing is something they continue to use with future Starfield updates. But that said, that is the recent update to Starfield. I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments down below. What do you think about the timing, the scale of this update, as well as some of those performance gains? Although if you are interested in more Starfield content, check out this video where I show you some of the best new mods to download for the game.